Chapter 1. Shadows on the Spanish Horizon. The amber glow of the setting sun stretched over the plains of Andalusia, casting long, wavering shadows across the undulating hills and olive groves. A lonely figure moved along the dusty path leading to the small village of Aranjuez, his silhouette blending with the whispers of the twilight. Mateo Garcia, a man whose name was known to only a few, but whose sorrows ran deeper than any river, clutched a worn satchel to his side. Inside it lay the fragments of his shattered life, a photograph, yellowed by time, and a letter never sent. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of wild lavender and the damp earth from a recent rain. Each step Mateo took resonated like a silent confession, the soles of his worn boots stirring up tiny clouds of dust. In the distance, the bell of the village church tolled its evening call. He paused for a moment, his breath catching, as the sound reverberated through the valley like a memory long suppressed. Aranjuez was a village like many others, perched on the edge of forgetting. Its cobbled streets wound their way through homes of whitewashed stone, the kind that reflected the heat of the sun during the day and clung to the coolness of the night. Despite its quiet beauty, there was an unease in the air, a stillness that seemed unnatural. Mateo felt it immediately as he crossed into the village square, where a fountain stood, cracked and dry, its once proud cherub now covered in moss. He knew he was being watched, not by eyes peering from the shuttered windows, but by something more elusive, an unspoken past that lingered in the corners of the village like an unwelcome guest. The satchel grew heavier with every step, and Mateo finally found himself outside the house he had once called home. It stood at the edge of the village, a modest structure framed by two olive trees whose gnarled branches seemed to stretch out like arms yearning for an embrace. The windows were dark, and the paint on the shutters had peeled away, revealing the raw wood beneath. Mateo hesitated before pushing the door open. It creaked, protesting his intrusion, and the scent of old wood and forgotten dreams rushed out to greet him. Inside, the room was as he remembered it, bare, save for a single wooden table, a pair of chairs, and a fireplace where the embers of his childhood had once burned brightly. He set the satchel down on the table and pulled out the photograph. It depicted a young woman with a smile so radiant it could rival the sun. She stood beneath the very olive trees outside, her arms wrapped around a younger, happier version of Mateo. Her name was Isabel, and she was the reason he had returned. Years had passed since he'd left Aranjuez, chasing dreams that had turned to ash in his hands. He had sworn never to return, but the weight of the unsent letter in his satchel had drawn him back like a moth to a flame. The letter was addressed to Isabel, written in a moment of desperation but never delivered. He unfolded the paper, his hands trembling. The words he had written so long ago stared back at him, their meaning unchanged. Isabel, there are no words for what I feel. Every day without you is a lifetime spent in shadows. Forgive me for leaving, for not being the man you deserved. I will carry you with me always, no matter where I go. And if I ever return, it will be only to you. The sound of the church bell broke the silence again, jolting Mateo from his reverie. He folded the letter and placed it back in the satchel, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Isabel would never read it. She was gone, taken from this world by a fever that swept through the village years ago, leaving him with nothing but memories and regrets. As the first stars pierced the darkening sky, Mateo stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The olive trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their branches casting shadows that danced like ghosts in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a guitar drifted through the air, carrying with it the echoes of a love lost but never forgotten. In that moment, Mateo vowed to stay. He could not bring Isabel back, but perhaps, in this village where their story began, he could find a way to honor her memory. The shadows on the horizon seemed to soften, as if the land itself understood his pain. Mateo closed his eyes and let the night envelop him, its cool embrace a small comfort against the ache in his chest. Tomorrow, he thought, would be the first step toward healing. But tonight, he would let the shadows linger, a reminder of all he had lost and all he had yet to find. Chapter 2. Echoes Beneath the Olive Trees. Morning in Aranjuez was a quiet affair, where time seemed to stretch, unhurried by the concerns of the outside world. The sun rose slowly, gilding the village in soft light that kissed the rooftops and seeped through the gaps in weathered shutters. Mateo awoke to the sound of distant birdsong, a melody that carried a strange blend of peace and sorrow. It was the kind of sound that reminded him of simpler days, when he and Isabel would sit beneath the olive trees, weaving dreams from the wind. The house greeted him with silence. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stepped into the kitchen, where a ceramic pitcher and a single chipped cup awaited him. He filled the cup with water from the well outside, its coolness startling him into wakefulness. The satchel, still resting on the wooden table, seemed to call out to him. But Mateo ignored it for now. There was work to be done. The olive grove stretched behind the house, its ancient trees standing like sentinels against the horizon. Their gnarled trunks and twisted branches seemed almost alive, whispering secrets that only the wind could understand. Mateo took a deep breath and stepped into the grove, his footsteps crunching softly against the dry earth. Each tree held a memory. This was where he and Isabel had spent countless afternoons, their laughter echoing through the grove as they imagined a future that now felt like a distant dream. He could almost see her, her dress flowing as she danced between the trees, her eyes sparkling with a joy that had once made the world feel boundless. But the grove was different now. Weeds had crept in, choking the life from the soil, and the trees bore no fruit. It was as if the land itself had mourned Isabel's loss, retreating into a silence that mirrored Mateo's own grief. He knelt by the base of one of the oldest trees, his fingers tracing the rough bark. Carved into its surface were the initials they had etched there long ago. M+I. The letters were faint, weathered by time, but they were still there, a testament to a love that refused to fade. The sound of footsteps startled him. He turned to see an elderly woman standing at the edge of the grove, her figure framed by the morning light. She wore a black shawl draped over her shoulders, and her face was lined with the wisdom of a life lived fully. It was Dona Carmen, the village healer and keeper of stories. Mateo remembered her from his childhood, a woman whose presence had always commanded both respect and a touch of fear. "You've returned," she said, her voice soft yet firm, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Mateo rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Yes, Dona Carmen, I have." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze penetrating. "The grove has been waiting for you," she said finally, her words carrying a weight that Mateo did not fully understand. "I'm not sure what I can do for it," he admitted, glancing around at the neglected trees. "You can listen," she said simply. "The land remembers. It holds the echoes of what was and what could have been. If you listen closely, it will guide you." Before Mateo could respond, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the village like a shadow dissolving in the light. He stood there for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. The land remembers. What could it possibly remember that he did not already carry in his heart? The day passed slowly as Mateo worked in the grove, clearing the weeds and tending to the trees. The labor was exhausting but oddly soothing, each swing of the scythe and turn of the soil grounding him in the present. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the grove in golden light, Mateo paused to survey his work. The grove still looked tired, but there was a subtle shift, a glimmer of hope in the way the leaves caught the evening breeze. For the first time in years, Mateo felt something stir within him, a flicker of purpose that he had thought long extinguished. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, the satchel once again drew his attention. He reached for it, pulling out the photograph of Isabel. Her eyes seemed to meet his, full of life and possibility. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can fix what's broken, but I'll try. For you." The letter remained untouched, its weight heavier than ever. Mateo knew he wasn't ready to face the words he had written. Not yet. But the echoes beneath the olive trees had begun to call to him, and he knew that in their whispers lay the answers he sought. As sleep claimed him, the dreams came, vivid and bittersweet. He saw Isabel, her laughter filling the grove as she danced among the trees. But the dream shifted, her figure fading into the shadows, her voice growing faint. Mateo woke with a start, the room bathed in the pale light of dawn. The echoes of his dream lingered, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The grove was calling, and Mateo knew that his journey was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Veil of Autumn's Promise. The first signs of autumn arrived with the faint rustle of dry leaves carried by the wind, which danced its way through the olive grove, tugging gently at Mateo's shirt as if to urge him onward. He stood at the edge of the grove, the early morning sun casting a soft glow over the landscape. There was a crispness in the air, a reminder of change, both in the seasons and in himself. For days now, Mateo had worked tirelessly, pruning the neglected trees and clearing the tangled undergrowth that had taken root in the grove. His hands were blistered, and his muscles ached, but the work was a balm for his restless spirit. With every branch he cut and every weed he pulled, it was as if a part of his own pain was being stripped away. The villagers had begun to notice his presence, their curious glances lingering a little longer each time he ventured into the square for supplies. Mateo could feel their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Why had he returned? What did he hope to achieve in a place that had long since moved on without him? But the answers eluded even Mateo. All he knew was that he felt drawn to this land, to the grove that held so many memories of Isabel. Perhaps it was guilt that had brought him back, or perhaps it was the hope of finding some semblance of redemption in the place where their story had begun. As he worked in the grove that morning, Mateo's mind wandered back to the autumns of his youth. Isabel had loved this season, her joy infectious as she gathered fallen leaves and pressed them into a leather-bound journal she kept hidden beneath her bed. She would show him the pages, each one a kaleidoscope of color and texture, and tell him that every leaf was a promise, a reminder that even as the world changed, beauty could still be found. "Every leaf has a story, Mateo," she would say, her eyes alight with wonder. "We just have to listen." He could almost hear her voice now, carried on the wind that swept through the grove. It was a bittersweet memory, one that filled him with both warmth and longing. By midday, Mateo had cleared a section of the grove he hadn't touched in years. It was a small clearing surrounded by the oldest trees, their branches arching overhead to form a natural canopy. In the center of the clearing stood a single stone bench, weathered by time but still sturdy. This had been their sanctuary. It was here that he and Isabel had shared their dreams, whispered secrets, and stolen kisses beneath the watchful eyes of the olive trees. Mateo ran his fingers over the rough surface of the bench, his heart heavy with the weight of those memories. As he sat down, his gaze fell on something half buried in the soil at his feet. He knelt to uncover it, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of a small locket. He recognized it immediately. It was Isabel's. The locket was shaped like a heart, its once shiny surface now tarnished with age. He opened it carefully, revealing a tiny photograph of Isabel on one side and a dried petal on the other. The petal had long since lost its color, but Mateo remembered it vividly. It had been from a rose he had given her on the night of the village festival, a night that now felt like a lifetime ago. The discovery shook him. How had the locket ended up here, forgotten and buried beneath the soil? Isabel had cherished it, wearing it every day until the fever had taken her. He thought it had been lost with her, buried in the ground along with everything else they had shared. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead, and Mateo felt a chill run down his spine. The grove, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, now felt charged with an energy he couldn't explain. He held the locket tightly in his hand and rose to his feet. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to shift, as if watching him. Mateo shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over him. He told himself it was just his imagination, the result of too many memories stirred up by the locket's discovery. But as he made his way back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the grove was trying to tell him something. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mateo sat by the fireplace, the locket resting on the table before him. He stared at it, turning it over in his hands, as if hoping it would reveal its secrets. He thought about Dona Carmen's words. The land remembers. Had she known about the locket? Had she known it was buried there, waiting for him to find it? The fire crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in Mateo's chest. He reached for the satchel and pulled out the letter once more. This time, he unfolded it completely, his eyes scanning the words he had written so long ago. Every day without you is a lifetime spent in shadows. The words felt heavier now, weighed down by the passage of time and the unspoken truths they carried. Mateo closed his eyes, the image of Isabel's smile etched into his mind. As the night deepened, a plan began to take shape in his thoughts. The grove was more than just a place. It was a connection to Isabel, a bridge between the past and the present. If he could restore it, breathe life back into the trees, perhaps he could find a way to honor her memory. The locket lay in his hand, its cool metal warming beneath his touch. Mateo slipped it into his pocket, a silent promise forming in his heart. Tomorrow, he would begin again, with renewed purpose and a determination to listen to the echoes beneath the olive trees. Outside, the wind whispered through the grove, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 4: Fragments of a Shattered Moon. The days in Aranjuez seemed to stretch endlessly, the hours melting together beneath the golden haze of autumn. Mateo found himself growing accustomed to the rhythm of the village, the gentle hum of life that stirred with the sunrise, the murmurs of conversation that echoed in the square, and the solemn silence that blanketed the streets after dusk. Yet, amidst the village's stillness, Mateo's world felt anything but quiet. The locket weighed heavily in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of Isabel and the mysteries she had left behind. Each night, he would sit by the fire, turning it over in his hands, and each morning, he would step into the grove with a sense of purpose that felt both foreign and familiar. The grove had begun to transform under his care. The trees, once weighed down by neglect, now seemed to stand a little taller, their branches reaching eagerly for the sun. The earth beneath them, freshly tilled and free of weeds, exuded a faint, earthy aroma that spoke of renewal. Mateo worked tirelessly, pouring every ounce of his energy into restoring the land. But even as he labored, the whispers persisted. It started subtly, barely audible murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind, weaving through the trees like threads of an ancient melody. At first, Mateo dismissed them as figments of his imagination, the product of exhaustion and the weight of his memories. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, their tones fluctuating between gentle and insistent. One afternoon, while pruning a particularly gnarled olive tree near the clearing, Mateo heard it again. This time, The whisper was unmistakable, its syllables forming a single, chilling word. Perdón. Mateo froze, his hands gripping the shears tightly. The word hung in the air, delicate yet charged with an emotion he couldn't place. He turned, his eyes scanning the grove for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the swaying branches and the distant hum of cicadas. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The grove answered with silence. Shaking off his unease, Mateo resumed his work, but the incident lingered in his mind long after the sun had set. That evening, he made his way to the village square, seeking solace in the familiar glow of the lamplights and the muted chatter of the townsfolk. It was there, by the fountain, that he encountered Dona Carmen once more. The healer sat on a stone bench, her shawl wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders. Her eyes, sharp despite their age, fixed on Mateo as he approached. "The grove speaks to you, doesn't it?" she asked, her tone devoid of surprise. Mateo hesitated, unsure how to respond. I'm not sure. I keep hearing things." "Whispers." Dona Carmen nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting his answer. "The grove remembers, Mateo. It carries the echoes of those who have walked among its trees, those who have loved and lost beneath its branches. But why now?" Mateo asked, his voice laced with frustration. "Why is it speaking to me?" "Because you're listening," she replied simply. "The grove knows your heart, just as it knew hers. Perhaps it seeks to guide you, or perhaps it seeks forgiveness." Mateo frowned. "Forgiveness for what?" Dona Carmen's gaze grew distant, her expression unreadable. "That is for you to discover." The cryptic nature of her words left Mateo with more questions than answers. As he walked back to his house, the locket pressed against his chest, he couldn't help but feel as though the grove was hiding something. Something that Isabel had never told him. The next day, Mateo returned to the clearing, determined to uncover whatever secrets lay buried beneath the soil. Armed with a spade and a sense of resolve, he began digging near the stone bench where the locket had been found. The earth was surprisingly loose, yielding easily to his efforts, and it wasn't long before he unearthed something unusual. It was a wooden box, small and intricately carved, its surface adorned with delicate patterns of olive branches and roses. The box was sealed with a rusted clasp, and though the wood was weathered, it remained intact. Mateo's hands trembled as he pried the clasp open. Inside, he found a bundle of letters, their edges frayed and their ink faded but still legible. The sight of Isabel's handwriting sent a jolt through his chest, and he carefully unfolded the topmost letter. "My dearest Mateo," it began. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes, but he forced himself to read on. "If you are reading this, then the grove has kept its promise. It has brought you back to me, even if only in spirit. There is so much I wish I could tell you, so much I wish I could undo. But the grove remembers, and it will guide you as it has guided me. Please, forgive me for the secrets I've kept. The answers lie beneath the olive trees, waiting for you to find them." The letter ended abruptly. The ink smudged as though Isabel had hesitated before finishing her thoughts. Mateo stared at the box and its contents, his mind racing. What secrets had Isabel hidden from him? What had she meant by the grove's promise? The whispers returned then, louder and more insistent, their tones weaving together into a mournful harmony. Mateo clenched the letter in his hand, the weight of its words pressing heavily on his heart. The grove was alive with a purpose he couldn't yet fathom, its ancient branches swaying as if urging him to continue. Mateo knelt by the bench, his resolve strengthening. Whatever truth lay hidden in the grove, he was determined to uncover it. For Isabel, for himself, and for the love that refused to be silenced. Chapter 5. The Roots of Secrets. The dawn broke over Aranjuez, painting the grove in shades of amber and crimson. Mateo sat on the stone bench in the clearing, the box of letters resting beside him. He had spent the night poring over their contents, his heart unraveling with each word Isabel had penned. Some letters spoke of their shared dreams and tender moments, while others hinted at a shadow of regret that had haunted her in the years before her passing. One letter, in particular, stood out, its edges darker than the others, as if it had been written in haste. "There is something you must know, Mateo. The grove holds more than memories. It holds truths that I could never bring myself to share. I wanted to protect you, but in doing so, I may have only deepened the wound. Seek the place where the first tree was planted. There, you will find what I could not say." The words weighed heavily on Mateo as he traced his steps back to the grove that morning. His thoughts raced, grappling with the mystery Isabel had left behind. What truth could be so profound, so devastating, that she had carried it silently to her grave? The grove was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through. Mateo's boots crunched against the soft earth as he made his way deeper into the grove, toward the heart of the land where the oldest olive tree stood. The tree was a towering sentinel, its gnarled trunk twisting upward as if reaching for the heavens. Its branches bore the marks of centuries, their boughs heavy with fruit that glistened in the morning light. Mateo remembered this tree well. It was here, beneath its sprawling canopy, that he and Isabel had carved their initials into the bark all those years ago. As he approached, his fingers brushed against the carvings, now faded but still visible. The sight of their entwined initials brought a bittersweet smile to his lips, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. The letter had spoken of a truth buried beneath the roots, and Mateo had come prepared. He retrieved his spade from where he had left it and began to dig. The soil was dense, compacted by time and the weight of the tree's history. Sweat beaded on Mateo's brow as he worked, the muscles in his arms burning with the effort. Yet, he pressed on, driven by an unshakable need to uncover whatever Isabel had hidden. It wasn't long before the spade struck something solid. The sound reverberated through the grove, sharp and unexpected. Mateo knelt, brushing the dirt away with his hands until a small wooden chest came into view. The chest was unassuming, its surface worn smooth by the years. Mateo hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding as he contemplated what he might find inside. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of items, each one seemingly mundane, yet imbued with an air of significance. There was a handkerchief embroidered with Isabel's initials, a dried bouquet of lavender, and a small book bound in cracked leather. Beneath them, a folded piece of parchment caught Mateo's attention. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten lines. "My beloved Mateo," it began. "There is no easy way to say this, and I fear you will hate me for what I have done. But the truth must be known, even if it shatters the foundation of what we once shared." Mateo's hands trembled as he continued reading. "When we were young, I made a choice that has haunted me ever since. It was born of fear and desperation, but it was a choice I can never undo. The grove, this land, it is not what it seems. Beneath its beauty lies a history of sorrow, one that I unwittingly became a part of. The locket you found was not lost by accident. It was meant to lead you here, to the place where our story truly began." The letter ended abruptly, the ink trailing off as if Isabel had been interrupted. Mateo's mind reeled, struggling to piece together the fragments of her confession. What choice had she made? What sorrow lay buried beneath the grove's serene exterior? He turned his attention to the book, its cover unmarked save for a single olive branch etched into the leather. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches, accounts of the grove's history, its significance to the village, and the legends that surrounded it. One entry, in particular, caught his eye. It spoke of a tradition passed down through generations, a ritual performed beneath the oldest tree to honor the spirits of the land. According to the text, the ritual was meant to protect the grove, ensuring its prosperity and the well-being of those who tended it. But there was another entry, hastily scrawled in the margins, that told a darker tale. It spoke of a price that had to be paid for the grove's blessings, a sacrifice made to appease the spirits when the land fell into disrepair. Mateo's breath caught in his throat. Could this be the sorrow Isabel had written about? Had she been a part of such a ritual, driven by fear and desperation? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far from clear. Mateo closed the book, his hands shaking as he placed it back into the chest. The grove seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if it too was waiting for the truth to be uncovered. Mateo stood, his resolve hardening. He would not rest until he had unraveled the secrets Isabel had left behind, no matter how painful they might be. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Mateo returned to the house with the chest in tow. The grove's whispers followed him, their tones both mournful and expectant. That night, as he sat by the fire with the book open before him, Mateo felt the weight of the grove's history pressing down on him. The past was not something he could escape, but perhaps, through understanding, he could find a way to make peace with it. The answers lay within the grove, and Mateo knew that his journey was far from over. The roots of its secrets ran deep, and he was determined to uncover every last one. Chapter 6: The Wound That Whispers. The grove was alive in a way Mateo had never fully noticed before. Its trees seemed to whisper in a language he couldn't understand, their branches swaying in unison even when there was no wind. The energy that pulsed through the land felt heavier now, more insistent, as though the grove itself were urging him to continue down the path Isabel had left for him. Mateo awoke at dawn, the chest and its contents still laid out on the table where he had left them the night before. The book of legends and rituals rested open, its faded ink inviting further exploration. As the morning light seeped through the windows, casting golden rays across the room, he picked up where he had left off. One passage in particular captured his attention. The oldest tree in the grove is sacred, its roots entwined with the spirits of those who have come before. The tree holds their secrets, their joys, and their sorrows. It is said that the land will flourish as long as its caretakers remain true, but if they falter, the spirits will demand recompense. In such times, a sacrifice must be made to restore balance, a life for the grove, offered beneath its ancient boughs. The words sent a chill through Mateo's spine. He could hardly imagine Isabel being part of something so sinister. Yet the evidence, the whispers, the letters, the buried chest, pointed to a hidden truth that he couldn't ignore. Setting the book aside, Mateo dressed and made his way to the grove. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint aroma of olive blossoms and damp earth. He walked slowly, his boots sinking into the soft soil with each step. When he reached the clearing, he found himself drawn once again to the ancient tree. Its massive trunk seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, the carved initials on its surface standing out starkly against the weathered bark. Mateo rested a hand on the tree, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingers. "Why did you do it, Isabel?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What were you trying to protect?" The grove responded with silence, save for the faint rustling of leaves overhead. Mateo's thoughts drifted to the villagers. They had always treated the grove with a mix of reverence and caution, speaking of it in hushed tones and avoiding it after sunset. Could they have known about the rituals, the sacrifices? Determined to find answers, Mateo decided to visit the only person who might hold the key to the grove's secrets, Dona Carmen. The healer's cottage sat on the edge of the village, its stone walls covered in ivy and its windows framed by curtains of lace. Dona Carmen greeted Mateo at the door, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his disheveled appearance. "You found something, haven't you?" she said, her tone more statement than question. Mateo nodded. "I found a chest buried beneath the old tree. Letters, a book." Isabel knew something about the grove. Something terrible. Dona Carmen stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The inside of her cottage was warm and dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of dried herbs and burning candles. Mateo took a seat at the small wooden table, his hands resting on the surface as he recounted everything he had discovered. When he finished, Dona Carmen let out a long, weary sigh. "The grove is older than this village, older than any of us can comprehend," she began. "It has always been a place of power, a sanctuary, but also a prison. The spirits of the land are tied to it, and they demand balance. When that balance is disrupted, a sacrifice is required." Mateo finished, his voice heavy. Dona Carmen nodded solemnly. "It is a terrible truth, one that we have tried to bury over the years. But the grove does not forget." Mateo leaned forward, his gaze intense. Was Isabel part of this? Did we, owe a debt to the grove? Dona Carmen hesitated, her expression unreadable. "I do not know all the details, but I do know this. Isabel loved you more than life itself. Whatever she did out of love and desperation. Perhaps she sought to protect you, or perhaps she believed she could break the cycle." Her words offered little comfort. Mateo left the cottage with a heart heavier than when he had arrived. That evening, he returned to the grove, unable to shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, their tones weaving together into a haunting symphony that seemed to emanate from the depths of the grove. Mateo stood beneath the ancient tree, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stillness. The grove answered with a sudden gust of wind, its force sending leaves and branches swaying wildly. At his feet, the earth shifted, revealing the faint outline of a path that led deeper into the grove. Taking a deep breath, Mateo followed the path, his steps guided by an invisible force. The trail wound through the trees, leading him to a small, secluded clearing. At its center stood a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. The sight of it took his breath away. This was the place Isabel had written about, the site of the rituals, the sacrifices. Mateo approached the altar cautiously, his mind racing. On the altar lay a small, rusted blade and a bundle of dried olive branches tied with a crimson ribbon. Beside them was a note, its edges curled with age. "To the one who seeks forgiveness, the truth lies in what you are willing to give." Mateo stared at the words, his chest tightening. The grove demanded balance, but what price was he willing to pay? As the whispers swirled around him, growing louder and more desperate, Mateo realized that the answers he sought would not come easily. The grove was testing him, forcing him to confront the depths of his own heart. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the grove into shadow, Mateo knew that his journey was far from over. The secrets of the grove ran deep, their roots entwined with his own fate. To uncover the truth, he would have to face the echoes of the past and the sacrifices they demanded. Chapter 7. The Weight of the Unspoken. The altar lingered in Mateo's mind long after he returned to the house, its weathered stones and ominous offerings etched into his memory. The grove had led him there, its whispers beckoning him toward truths he was not sure he was ready to face. He sat in the quiet of the study, Isabel's letters spread across the table like fragments of a mosaic. Each word carried her voice, soft and trembling, as if she had been speaking from the edge of a precipice. Mateo felt the weight of her pain, the choices she had made, and the secrets she had guarded fiercely until her final breath. One letter stood apart from the others, its parchment older and more fragile. He hesitated before unfolding it, as though the act itself would unravel something irrevocable. "Mateo," it began, "I pray you never find this letter. But if you have, it means I failed to protect the truth from you. I feared that the grove's demands would one day return, that its shadows would reach for you as they did for me." His breath caught. The letter continued, "The grove is alive, Mateo, not in the way trees and soil are alive, but in a way that transcends understanding. It watches, it listens, and it remembers. Our family has been its keeper for generations, and with that role comes a bond, an unbreakable connection. But it is also a burden, one that has taken more from me than I ever thought possible." The words blurred as tears welled in Mateo's eyes. Isabel had always been strong, her presence steady even in the face of hardship. To imagine her carrying this secret, alone and in silence, broke something inside him. "There is a truth I have hidden from you, a truth that may shatter everything you know. The grove, our grove, has never been ours. We belong to it. Every choice we make, every step we take, it shapes our lives in ways we cannot see. I tried to defy it, Mateo. I tried to rewrite the story it had written for us. But in doing so, I may have doomed us both." The letter ended abruptly. The ink smudged as if her hand had trembled while writing. Mateo leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. The grove's influence extended far beyond its boundaries. It had shaped their family's history, intertwining their fates with its own. But what had Isabel meant by defiance? What act had she committed that she feared would doom them? The following morning, Mateo returned to the grove, his steps hesitant but determined. The whispers greeted him immediately, a soft chorus that seemed to rise and fall with his heartbeat. He walked to the ancient tree, the one that had stood at the center of his childhood memories and now seemed to hold the answers to his deepest questions. He rested his hand on its trunk, closing his eyes as he listened to the rhythm of the grove. A memory surfaced, one he had buried deep in the recesses of his mind. He was a boy, no more than 8 years old, running through the grove with Isabel. They had stumbled upon a clearing he had never seen before, its air heavy with the scent of olives and something else, something metallic. Isabel had pulled him back, her grip tight and her voice sharp. "We mustn't go there, Mateo," she had said, her tone more frightened than he had ever heard. "That place is not for us." But now, Mateo knew it wasn't fear that had driven her words. It was knowledge. Determined to uncover the truth, Mateo ventured deeper into the grove, retracing the steps from his childhood memory. The air grew colder as he walked, the sunlight dimming despite the clear sky overhead. The grove seemed to close in around him, its trees forming a labyrinth of twisted branches and tangled roots. At last, he reached the clearing. It was smaller than he remembered, its edges marked by a circle of smooth stones. In the center stood a smaller tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened as though it had been scorched. The ground beneath it was barren, devoid of the life that thrived elsewhere in the grove. As Mateo stepped into the clearing, the whispers grew louder, their tones sharper and more urgent. He knelt beside the blackened tree, his fingers brushing against the cold, lifeless bark. Beneath its roots, something glinted in the dim light. Mateo began to dig, his hands scraping against the hard earth until they uncovered a small, tarnished locket. He opened it carefully, revealing a miniature portrait inside. It was Isabel, her features delicate and her expression solemn. Opposite her portrait was an engraving. "For love, I give everything." Mateo's chest tightened. The locket was not unfamiliar. He had seen it once, years ago, around Isabel's neck. She had worn it always, until one day it had disappeared without explanation. The grove's whispers seemed to crescendo, their tones weaving into a symphony of sorrow and resolve. Mateo clutched the locket, its weight both comforting and suffocating. What had Isabel given? What had she sacrificed beneath this blackened tree? That night, Mateo sat by the fire, the locket clutched in one hand and the book of rituals in the other. He pored over its pages, searching for any mention of the blackened tree or the clearing of stones. One passage caught his attention. When the bond between the grove and its keeper is broken, the land will bear the scars. The blackened tree is both a warning and a testament, a reminder of the price paid for defiance. Mateo stared at the words, his mind racing. Isabel's act of defiance had left its mark, not only on the grove, but on their family as well. She had tried to protect him, to shield him from the grove's demands, but at what cost? As the fire crackled and the shadows danced along the walls, Mateo felt the weight of his inheritance settle over him. The grove's secrets were not just his to uncover, they were his to bear. And as the night deepened, he resolved to confront the grove once and for all. The whispers would no longer haunt him. The shadows would no longer hide the truth. Mateo would face whatever lay ahead, for Isabel, for himself, and for the grove that had shaped their lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Chapter 8. The Ties That Bind the Soul. The grove loomed before Mateo like a sentinel of ancient truths, its shadows stretching endlessly as the morning sun struggled to break through its dense canopy. For the first time in his life, he felt not only a sense of awe but a deep, gnawing dread. The blackened tree, the locket, and Isabel's haunting words in the letter circled his thoughts like vultures over a carcass. He stood at the edge of the grove, the locket still warm from the heat of his palm. It felt alive, as though it pulsed with the rhythm of the grove itself. Today, he would demand answers from the land that had claimed so much from his family. Mateo stepped into the grove, his movements deliberate yet hesitant. The whispers were immediate, weaving around him like threads of an intricate tapestry. Their tone was different now, not merely curious but almost pleading. The air was heavy with anticipation, every step he took seeming to echo through the grove like the toll of a bell. The path to the blackened tree felt longer this time, as though the grove itself was stretching to test his resolve. Mateo's mind drifted to the stories he had heard as a child, fables of brave souls who ventured too deep into sacred lands and were swallowed whole by the earth. Yet he pressed on, the locket around his neck a talisman against the unknown. When he finally reached the clearing, the blackened tree stood like a monument to loss and rebellion. Its lifeless bark seemed darker in the daylight, absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. The circle of stones around it was undisturbed, but something had changed. A second object rested at the tree's base, glinting faintly in the filtered light. Mateo approached cautiously, kneeling to retrieve it. It was another piece of jewelry, a delicate bracelet made of woven silver strands, tarnished with age but still intact. He recognized it instantly. It had belonged to his mother. The realization hit him like a wave, memories of her laughter and warmth flooding back with the suddenness of a summer storm. She had always worn that bracelet, a token of her connection to the grove, or so she had claimed. But after her death, the bracelet had disappeared, much like Isabel's locket. Mateo sat back on his heels, his breath shallow. The grove had taken them both, first his mother, then his sister. They had been bound to it in ways he was only beginning to understand. And now, it was his turn. As he clutched the bracelet, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. They weren't random this time. They formed patterns, words spoken in a language that hovered just beyond his comprehension. Mateo closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm, the rise and fall of the voices. Then, for the first time, The whispers shifted into something recognizable, a single word. Reclaim. The word reverberated through him, spoken not in anger, but in quiet urgency. Mateo opened his eyes, his heart pounding. The grove was calling him to action, but the meaning of its command eluded him. Reclaim what? His family's place as keepers of the grove? His connection to Isabel and his mother? Or something else entirely? He returned to the house, his mind racing. The bracelet lay on the table beside Isabel's letters and the ritual book, forming an unholy collection of the past. Mateo flipped through the book's fragile pages once more, scanning the text for anything that might illuminate the grove's cryptic message. One passage caught his attention. When the bond between the keeper and the grove is frayed, it is the task of the chosen to mend what was broken. The act of reclamation requires not only sacrifice but understanding. Only through the merging of past and present can the future be secured. The chosen. Mateo knew now that it was not merely an inheritance but a summons. The grove had chosen him, just as it had chosen Isabel and their mother before her. But unlike them, he had no intention of surrendering blindly. The mention of sacrifice weighed heavily on him. The grove had taken too much already. There had to be another way to restore the balance it so desperately sought. That night, Mateo returned to the grove. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the land. He carried the locket and the bracelet with him, their combined weight a reminder of the legacy he bore. As he approached the blackened tree, the whispers grew more frantic, their tones weaving between urgency and despair. The grove seemed alive with movement, its branches swaying in a wind Mateo could not feel. He stood before the altar of stones, placing the locket and bracelet at its center. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a stillness that was almost oppressive. "Tell me what you want," Mateo said, his voice breaking the silence. "You've taken so much. My mother, my sister. What else could you possibly need?" The grove answered not with words but with a vision. The air around him shimmered, the clearing dissolving into a scene from the past. Mateo saw his mother, her youthful face alight with determination as she stood before the blackened tree. In her hands, she held the bracelet, its silver strands glowing faintly. Beside her stood Isabel, younger and filled with a quiet defiance that Mateo recognized as his own. She held the locket, her hands trembling as she placed it on the altar. The vision shifted, revealing the two of them performing a ritual Mateo could not fully understand. Their voices rose in harmony, their words a plea for something, protection, perhaps, or forgiveness. Then came the sacrifice. His mother stepped forward, offering her bracelet to the tree. Isabel followed, her locket joining the bracelet on the altar. The grove seemed to accept their offerings, its whispers softening into a gentle hum. But Mateo saw the toll it took on them. His mother's face grew pale, her strength waning as though the grove had drained her vitality. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling as she clutched her chest. The vision faded, leaving Mateo alone once more in the clearing. He understood now. The grove had demanded not their lives but their essence, their vitality, their spirit. It had taken from them because they had given willingly, bound by a duty they could not escape. But Mateo was different. He was not willing to give in so easily. Standing before the blackened tree, he placed his hands on its bark, closing his eyes as he reached deep within himself. The whispers rose again, their tones questioning, curious. "I reclaim this bond," he said, his voice steady. "But I will not sacrifice myself. The grove is part of me, and I am part of it. We are one, bound not by servitude but by choice." The grove seemed to hesitate, its energy shifting as though considering his words. Then, slowly, the whispers softened, their tones blending into a single harmonious note. The locket and bracelet glowed faintly before vanishing into the earth. The blackened tree, once lifeless, began to change. Its bark grew lighter, its branches sprouting new leaves that shimmered in the moonlight. Mateo stepped back, his heart pounding. The grove had accepted his offering, not one of sacrifice but of unity. As he walked back to the house, the whispers faded into silence. For the first time in years, the grove felt at peace. And so did Mateo. Chapter 9. The Price of Peace. The days that followed the ritual felt like a fragile calm, an illusion built on the delicate balance Mateo had restored. The grove no longer whispered in his ears, no longer demanded his attention with its ever-present hum. The oppressive weight that had clouded his life for so long seemed to lift, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe freely, unburdened. But the calm was deceptive. Peace, Mateo had come to learn, was never without its cost. He woke one morning to find the house suffocatingly still. There was no chirping of birds from the windowsills, no rustling of leaves from the trees outside. Even the wind had stilled its dance, leaving the world eerily quiet. A sense of dread settled in his chest as he moved through the house, the silence growing heavier with every step. Isabel had always hated the quiet. She would hum to herself as she worked, filling the air with her soft voice, and when that wasn't enough, she would talk to him. About the simplest things, about her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. But now, the house was empty. The absence of her presence was palpable, a gaping hole where her warmth had once been. Mateo went to her room, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The space was untouched, still as it had been the last time he'd seen her. Her desk was covered in her journals, her drawings, the unfinished pages of a life that had been cut short. A small photo of the two of them, taken on one of their childhood adventures in the grove, stood on the windowsill. Isabel had always been the one to hold onto memories. It was a trait he had admired in her, even when it made her seem distant. The absence of her now felt like a betrayal. The peace he had fought for seemed incomplete. What had the grove taken from him in exchange for its silence? He spent the morning walking the house, searching for answers that seemed as elusive as the wind. The answers, he soon realized, weren't in the house or the grove. They were within him, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Mateo sat in the study, flipping through Isabel's journals, trying to make sense of the fragmented thoughts that filled the pages. He had read them countless times, but now they felt different. Now, they held a new weight, a new urgency. One journal entry caught his eye. It was dated the day before her disappearance. "I've seen it again. The grove has changed, and so have I. The weight of what I've learned is too much to bear. Mateo, I hope you never find this, but if you do, know that I've done what I could to protect you. The grove wants us, wants more from us than we understand. I can't run from it, but you can. You must leave. I'm sorry I can't be what you need, but you have to go before it takes any more from us. Before it takes you." The words were desperate, a cry for help that had been buried beneath layers of resignation. Mateo could feel the fear in every sentence, a fear that mirrored his own. Isabel had known something he didn't, something that had pushed her to make the ultimate choice. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land. Mateo felt the pull of the grove again, its silent call echoing in his chest. He had once believed the grove's silence to be a sign of peace, but now he understood it for what it was, an unsettling stillness that heralded the calm before the storm. The grove had given him respite, but it had not freed him. He walked to the edge of the property, where the land began to slope down into the wild expanse of trees. The air was thick with the scent of earth and growing things, but there was something else, something old, ancient, lurking beneath the surface. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet, and the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. They were not the familiar voices of the grove. These were new voices, unfamiliar and jagged, like broken shards of glass scraping against his mind.
Mateo.
The voice was clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. His heart skipped a beat as he turned, scanning the darkening landscape. There was no one there. Only the grove, its dark silhouette growing more ominous in the twilight.
Mateo.
The voice came again, more insistent this time. It was not Isabel's voice, nor his mother's. It was deep, ancient, and filled with a hunger that unsettled him to his core. The ground beneath him rumbled once more, and Mateo stumbled backward, his breath quickening. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows that clung to it like a second skin. The face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood of deep violet that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its presence was unnerving, as though it did not belong to the world of the living, nor the dead. It was something in between, something born of the grove's oldest secrets. The voice called out again, this time from the figure itself. Mateo, it said, its tone an eerie blend of compassion and command. You've done well to reclaim the bond, but you are not free. You never were. Mateo's heart pounded in his chest, his legs frozen in place as he watched the figure advance toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. What are you? Mateo managed to ask, his voice shaky. The figure tilted its head, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the hood. I am the keeper of the grove's true will, the one who guides, the one who tests. You have disturbed the balance, Mateo. You have chosen the wrong path. The air grew colder, and the grove seemed to close in around him, its once familiar trees now alien and hostile. The whispers that had once been a soft hum were now a cacophony of voices, shouting at him, warning him, begging him to understand. You cannot undo what has been done, the figure continued, its voice like gravel grinding against stone. The grove has chosen you, just as it chose your mother and your sister. You are its blood, its legacy. But in trying to reclaim the bond, you have broken its delicate fabric. And now, the price must be paid. The weight of the figure's words settled over Mateo like a heavy cloak, its implications suffocating him. He had thought he had gained peace, but in reality, he had only delayed the inevitable. What price? Mateo asked, his voice hoarse. The figure's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. The grove does not grant peace without a cost, Mateo. The bloodline must be cleansed, its ties severed. Only then can the cycle end. Chapter 10. The Wound Beneath the Skin. Mateo woke to the sound of rain, soft and steady, pattering against the roof like the faintest of whispers. His body felt heavy, as though it had been dragged through a river of cold and mud. He lay still, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, disoriented by the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of his mind. The world was quiet, a quiet that felt wrong. He blinked against the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust to the faint light filtering through the window. He was in his bed, tucked beneath the familiar, worn covers. The same room, the same house, yet everything felt different. The stillness had grown thicker, suffocating the space in a way he couldn't name. The grove's whispers had faded, but their absence left an aching void in their place. The figure, the keeper of the grove's will, was it real? Had it all been a nightmare, an echo of his exhaustion? No. He knew deep in his gut that it hadn't been a dream. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something ancient and inevitable, was far too real. He sat up, his head swimming with the remnants of the encounter. His fingers brushed against his forehead, and a sharp pain shot through his temples, as if the memories themselves were etched into his skin, branded there with some cruel, unforgiving hand. But there was something else. His skin burned where the pain had touched him, like a wound that refused to heal. It wasn't a physical wound, not in the way one might expect, but something deeper, something that had been hidden beneath the surface, beneath the veneer of peace he had tried to build. Mateo rose from the bed, his feet meeting the cold floor with a muted thud. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on Isabel's empty side of the bed. It had been 2 weeks since she disappeared, and still, he had no answers. He had tried to reach out to the village, to ask if anyone had seen her, but they all turned away from him, as though the very mention of her name were enough to invite darkness into their homes. It was as though Isabel had never existed, as though she had never been there at all. His heart clenched in his chest, the pain of familiar ache that grew more unbearable with each passing day. What had happened to her? Had she been taken by the grove, consumed by the very forces she had warned him about? Or was there another truth, one that remained hidden in the shadows, beyond his reach? He didn't have the answers, but the need to find them had become an obsession, a fire that burned in his veins, urging him forward even when his mind screamed for him to stop. He couldn't just let it go. He couldn't accept that Isabel, the one person who had understood him more than anyone, had simply vanished without a trace. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling against the walls, as though the earth itself were mourning. Mateo moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The grove stood just beyond the trees, its silhouette haunting and dark against the rolling sky. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, a feeling he couldn't shake. And then he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the grove, motionless against the backdrop of the rain. His heart lurched in his chest as he squinted, trying to make out the shape in the distance. It was her. It had to be. The figure was too familiar, too much like the shadow that had haunted his dreams. Isabel. But she was too still, too quiet, her body draped in the same haunting silence that had overtaken the house. Mateo felt the pull of her presence, the magnetic force that urged him to go to her, to cross the threshold of the grove and into whatever it was that had consumed her. He couldn't move, though. His legs were frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. The air grew heavier, and the pain in his chest flared again, the wound beneath his skin pulsing with a rhythmic beat. Isabel had always been the one to draw him back from the edge, to remind him of the light when the darkness seemed overwhelming. But now, as he stared at her silhouette in the storm, all he saw was an emptiness, a vast expanse where even her spirit seemed to be lost. The wind howled louder, and the rain blurred his vision. In that moment, Mateo understood the true price of peace. It was not just a sacrifice of the flesh, but of the soul, of the very essence of who they were. The grove had taken Isabel, and it had taken something from him, too, a piece of his heart that would never return. He could no longer stand still, could no longer watch her from the window. Mateo grabbed his jacket, the cold leather cool against his skin, and made his way toward the door. He had to know the truth. He had to find out what had happened to Isabel, even if it meant walking into the very heart of the storm. The house seemed to whisper as he stepped outside, as though it, too, were warning him. But he paid it no mind. The pain that gripped him now was stronger than any fear, stronger than the groaning of the earth beneath his feet. The air was thick with rain as he stepped onto the path leading toward the grove. The world seemed to close in around him, the trees stretching their limbs like dark fingers, reaching for him, pulling him into their embrace. He could feel it now, the weight of the grove's presence, the way it watched him, the way it demanded his attention. It was ancient, unfathomable, and it had claimed Isabel, just as it had claimed so many others before her. As he walked deeper into the forest, the rain began to thin, and the temperature dropped, chilling him to the bone. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a soft murmur beneath the sound of the rain. But soon, they grew louder, sharper, like voices calling his name from the darkness. Mateo. The voice was his, but it was distorted, twisted by something otherworldly. It was as though the grove itself had found a way to speak through him, to use his voice to lure him further into its depths. Mateo. His breath quickened, his pulse hammering in his ears. The trees seemed to shift around him, their trunks bending in impossible angles, their branches twisting like the fingers of the dead. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to run, to escape from whatever force had taken hold of him. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave. The grove had marked him, and it would not let him go. Not until it had taken everything from him. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Mateo's heart raced, and he pressed forward, drawn into the dark heart of the forest. He knew now that there was no turning back. The wound beneath his skin throbbed painfully, and he could feel the weight of Isabel's absence, a presence that lingered in the space between the trees. The grove had stolen her from him, but it had not yet finished with him. And as Mateo walked deeper into the forest, the night seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a void he could not escape. The price of peace, he had learned, was not just the soul. It was the very essence of who they were. And the grove would not be satisfied until it had claimed all that was left of them. Chapter 11. The echo of what was. The silence that had settled over the grove was no longer comforting. It was suffocating, a heavy weight that pressed against Mateo's chest, as though the very air had turned to stone. His footsteps were muted beneath the thick layers of fallen leaves, the only sound the faint rustling of branches swaying in the breeze. The moonlight, pale and distant, filtered through the canopy above, casting long, ghostly shadows across the path that led deeper into the forest. Mateo felt as though he had entered a place where time itself no longer held meaning. Every step he took felt both infinite and fleeting, as if the ground beneath him was shifting, pulling him into the past, the present, and something far darker. The trees loomed around him like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky in unnatural angles, their bark weathered and scarred. It was as if the forest itself had lived for centuries, watching, waiting for him to arrive. His pulse quickened as the memories of Isabel flickered in his mind, vivid and painful. The way her eyes had shone with that soft, knowing smile, the way her laughter had filled the spaces between them, making everything feel warm and safe. And then, the emptiness when she vanished. The silence that had overtaken their home, choking the life from it. The deeper he walked into the grove, the more he realized that he had not come here for answers. Not really. He had come because there was something inside him that needed to know the truth, needed to understand why everything had unraveled, why the love they had shared, so simple and pure, had been torn apart by something so dark, so incomprehensible. His thoughts swirled with uncertainty as his feet carried him forward, past twisted trees and silent stones. He could feel the pull of something unseen, something waiting just beyond his reach. It was not the forest that called to him. It was her, Isabel. But she was no longer the girl he had known, no longer the woman he had loved. She had been touched by something that had marked her, altered her, and turned her into something unrecognizable. Mateo's chest tightened at the thought, the ache of her absence blooming into something more painful, more consuming. It was then that he saw it. The clearing. The moon broke through the clouds above, casting an eerie light onto the small patch of earth. The air was thick with moisture, heavy and suffocating, and the earth beneath his boots seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm. The clearing was empty, save for the twisted remnants of dead trees that rose like skeletal fingers from the ground. Their branches reached upward, as if grasping for something that had long been lost. And there, at the center of it all, was a stone, a large, jagged rock, half buried in the soil, with strange markings carved into its surface. The symbols were unlike anything Mateo had ever seen before. Twisted lines, spirals, and ancient sigils that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air hummed with energy, like a current running just beneath the surface of the earth. Mateo felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he approached the stone, the presence of the grove pressing in on him from all sides. He reached out, fingers trembling, and traced one of the symbols on the stone. The instant his skin made contact, a shock ran through him, like a bolt of electricity. His breath caught in his throat, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble in response. For a moment, he thought he had lost himself entirely, that he had been swallowed up by the forest, but then the sensation faded. He pulled his hand back, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. It was then that he heard it, a voice, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. Mateo. His blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. Isabel. She had called his name before, in dreams, in the whispers of the grove. But this time it was different. This time, the voice was clear. It was hers. He spun around, searching the shadows for any sign of her, but the clearing remained empty. His pulse raced, his body on edge, the rawness of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had to find her, had to know if this was real. Isabel, he called out, his voice cracking in the stillness. His words echoed through the grove, swallowed by the thick silence that followed. Nothing, but the air around him shifted. The breeze grew colder, and the shadows deepened, stretching like the fingers of some unseen force. He felt the presence of something watching him, something ancient and vast, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. Mateo took a step back, his breath coming faster now, his body on high alert. He had come here for answers, but all he had found was more confusion, more questions that only seemed to multiply. He reached for the stone again, his fingers tracing the symbols, this time with more purpose. There was something hidden here, something that held the key to understanding what had happened to Isabel. And then, as his fingers brushed against the cold stone, the world around him shifted once more. The clearing faded from view. The trees, the stone, the very ground beneath his feet dissolved into darkness. Mateo's heart hammered in his chest as he was swallowed by the blackness, unable to move, unable to breathe. For a long moment, he was suspended in nothingness, the weight of the forest pressing down on him from all sides. He gasped for air, but none came. The silence was deafening, oppressive, and yet he could feel something stirring, something beneath the surface of the void that pulsed with life. Then, a figure appeared. Isabel. But she was different. She was not the woman he had known. Her eyes were wide, her expression vacant, as though she were trapped in a dream she could not escape. Her hair, once soft and dark, was now wild and tangled, her clothes torn, her skin pale. Isabel, Mateo whispered, his voice raw with desperation. Please. But she didn't respond. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, a terrible noise filled the air, a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. It was the sound of something ancient, something terrible, and it echoed in Mateo's mind, filling him with dread. He reached out for her, but she stepped back, her form flickering like a flame in the wind. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with a sorrow so deep, so profound, that it broke something inside of him. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Isabel vanished, leaving only the hollow emptiness behind. Mateo fell to his knees, his hands clutching at the cold, invisible ground beneath him. The weight of loss, of everything he had once believed, pressed down on him with unbearable force. The truth was too much to bear. Isabel had not been lost to the world. She had been lost to something far darker, something that had claimed her soul, and he was powerless to save her. The darkness around him seemed to deepen, and Mateo could feel the pull of the grove once again, its shadows beckoning him. The truth had been laid bare, and now there was nothing left to do but face it. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of despair, there was a flicker of something else, something small, fragile, but undeniable. Hope. The grove had not claimed him yet, and as long as he still breathed, as long as there was still life within him, he would fight. He would find Isabel, and he would bring her back, no matter the cost. Chapter 12. The Heart of the Forest. The days following his encounter in the clearing passed in a haze, a blur of grief and disbelief that Mateo could hardly comprehend. Every night, he returned to the grove, unable to stay away. The pull of the forest was undeniable, a magnetic force that drew him back again and again, each time hoping to uncover more of the mystery that bound Isabel to this dark place. But each time, the forest remained silent, the shadows unyielding. Mateo no longer feared the forest's depth or the unsettling quiet that lingered like a presence in the air. The terror he had once felt had slowly morphed into something more intimate, more insistent. The forest had become an extension of his own heart, a reflection of the sorrow and longing that gnawed at him from within. He had come to understand that the grove was not simply a place where Isabel had been lost. It was a part of her now, just as it was becoming a part of him. The village had grown accustomed to his absence. His friends, once concerned, had stopped asking where he went, stopped checking to make sure he was safe. It was as though the sorrow had consumed him completely, and no one knew how to pull him out of it. His house, once filled with laughter and love, now stood empty, its silence echoing the emptiness inside him. And yet, with every passing day, Mateo felt the forest calling to him louder, as if it was no longer just a place where Isabel had disappeared, but a place where she still existed. It was as if the grove had swallowed her whole, and now it held her captive, buried beneath the roots and the soil. He couldn't explain it, but the thought of her there, somewhere within the earth, kept him going. It was the only thing that mattered anymore. It was the afternoon of the 13th day when he arrived at the clearing once again. The sky above was gray, heavy with the promise of rain, the wind a distant whisper in the trees. Mateo's heart beat in his chest like a drum, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of his feet as he ventured deeper into the forest. The air was thick, damp with the moisture of the earth, and the scent of wet leaves and moss filled his lungs with each breath. It was both suffocating and grounding at the same time. The stone that had once felt so cold now seemed to pulse with life under his fingers, warm and alive, as though it had absorbed the weight of his desperation. He had tried to leave it behind, to walk away, but the draw of the place was too strong, and the answers it promised too tantalizing to resist. Tonight, something felt different. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change that Mateo couldn't quite place, but that he knew instinctively. The trees around him seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking as if in conversation. The forest itself was alive, breathing, waiting. As he stepped into the clearing, he noticed something new. There, at the center of the stone, a single flower had bloomed. Its petals were an iridescent white, soft and delicate, almost translucent in the dim light. It looked out of place in the otherwise dark and damp clearing, as if it had been placed there by some unseen hand, a gift or a warning. Mateo knelt beside it, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch the petals. The flower was cool to the touch, its surface smooth and almost velvety, but it gave off no scent. It was beautiful in its simplicity, yet there was something haunting about it, as if it were a harbinger of something far greater, something hidden beneath the surface. He had no time to think further. The wind picked up, gusting through the trees, and a faint voice echoed through the clearing. It was Isabel's voice, soft and distant, like a memory that refused to fade. Mateo. His breath caught in his throat, his body tensed, every muscle screaming for action, for answers. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable, but it was not coming from any one direction. It seemed to swirl around him, rising from the earth, from the very air he breathed. Isabel? Mateo's voice cracked, a whisper of hope that he could hardly believe. He stood, his gaze darting around the clearing, searching the shadows, the trees, the stones. But there was nothing, only the faintest glimmer of the flower's pale petals. The voice came again, but this time it was not the soft whisper he had come to expect. This time, it was louder, sharper, tinged with pain. "Mateo, please. I am trapped." A chill ran down his spine. Her words struck him like a blow, each syllable heavy with sorrow, each word laced with a desperation he could not ignore. He could feel her pain as though it were his own. It wrapped around his heart, squeezing it until he could hardly breathe. She was calling to him, reaching out, but he could not see her, could not touch her. "Where are you, Isabel? Please tell me. I'll come for you." His voice was hoarse now, a raw edge of panic creeping into his chest. But the clearing remained still, the silence once again descending like a heavy fog. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind, the creak of the trees as they swayed. Mateo's heart raced. He knew that this was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that Isabel would finally show herself, would finally reveal the truth of what had happened to her. The feeling of being on the cusp of something immense, something life-altering, nearly overwhelmed him. And yet, despite the aching emptiness in his chest, he could feel that something was wrong. Something was not as it seemed. The forest was no longer a place of mystery, it was a place of danger. The darkness was no longer a void, but a force, an entity that had swallowed Isabel, and now it was watching him. It had always been watching. Suddenly, the air seemed to thicken. The trees creaked louder now, their branches twisting unnaturally, bending in ways that should have been impossible. The ground beneath Mateo's feet began to tremble, just slightly at first, as though the very earth was alive. He staggered back, his breath quickening as a deep, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere in the distance. The forest had not been waiting for Isabel to return. It had been waiting for him. Mateo turned and ran, his legs propelling him forward, driven by a sense of dread that pushed him faster than he had ever gone. The sound of the growl grew louder, closer, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift and buckle with every step. He could feel the weight of the forest closing in on him, the trees bending inward, their limbs reaching for him as if trying to grab hold of his very soul. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the tremors stopped. The growling faded, the wind calmed, and the clearing fell back into an eerie, unnatural silence. Mateo stood there, breathless, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to steady his mind. The forest had let him go, but for how long? The darkness, the pull, it would not release him so easily. And as long as it held Isabel captive, Mateo would continue to fight. He would return, again and again, until she was free. But for now, all he could do was stand, alone in the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. The forest had claimed him, and it would never let him go. Chapter 13. The Mirror of Souls. The days that followed Mateo's harrowing return from the clearing were marked by an oppressive stillness, an atmosphere that seemed to weigh down on him with an invisible force. The village was unchanged, the world around him indifferent to the turmoil that churned within him. But for Mateo, nothing would ever be the same again. He could not unsee what he had witnessed in the forest, the warning, the growl, the sense that he had crossed into something far darker, far more dangerous than he could comprehend. He had gone home that night, collapsed into his bed, and tried to sleep, but sleep had eluded him. His dreams were filled with fragmented images of Isabel's voice, her desperate cries, the faintest glimmer of her figure through the mist, and the sensation of something watching him, always watching. Even in his waking moments, the trees seemed to be there, looming at the edges of his vision, the forest lurking just beyond the boundaries of the village. Mateo had stopped returning to the clearing after that night. He could not bring himself to go back, not yet. The fear that gripped him was too strong, the memory of the growl too fresh. But still, the need to understand, to uncover the truth about Isabel and the forest, gnawed at him relentlessly. It was an itch he could not scratch, a question that refused to leave his mind. It was on the 14th day since his last encounter with the forest that Mateo found himself standing at the threshold of the village's small chapel. He hadn't planned on coming here, hadn't even known why his feet had carried him to this place. But now that he was here, there was a sense of inevitability, as if the chapel itself were calling to him, urging him to step inside. The wooden door creaked open, revealing a space bathed in a soft, golden light. The air was cool, filled with the scent of incense, and the flickering candles cast long shadows on the stone walls. It was a peaceful place, a refuge for the weary, a sanctuary for those seeking solace. But for Mateo, it was more than just a place of worship. It was the last place where he had seen Isabel, where they had sat together in the quiet after a Sunday Mass, their words a comfort against the rising storm in his heart. As he walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly against the cool stone, Mateo's mind raced. What was he looking for? Peace? Answers? Or perhaps he was simply seeking to find some trace of Isabel, some sign that she was still out there, still reachable. He didn't know. He only knew that the pull of the chapel, like the pull of the forest, was undeniable. At the altar, he stopped. The small wooden cross at its center stood tall and proud, but it was not the cross that held his gaze. Instead, it was the large mirror that hung just behind it, a full-length mirror that reflected the dimly lit room in its silvered surface. The mirror seemed out of place in the small, humble chapel, its presence incongruous with the simplicity of the surroundings. Mateo approached the mirror slowly, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As he stood before it, he could see his reflection, his pale face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the dark circles that had formed under his gaze. But something else caught his attention, something just out of reach. He leaned closer, peering into the depths of the glass. At first, it was faint, like a shadow passing in the corner of his vision. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw her. Isabel. Her figure was dim and blurry, as though seen through a fog, but it was undeniably her. She stood there, her eyes locked onto his through the mirror, her expression one of profound sadness, as though she were trying to convey something that Mateo could not fully understand. The image shifted, becoming clearer as he watched, her face now sharp and full of emotion, her lips moving soundlessly. Mateo's heart stopped in his chest. This was no ordinary mirror. It was a mirror of souls, a portal to the other side, to the very essence of Isabel's being. Isabel? His voice trembled as he spoke her name, his breath catching in his throat. The image in the mirror shifted again, her form blurring as though the glass was rippling. Then, as if caught in the flow of time itself, her image began to distort, her face twisted in anguish. She reached out toward him, her hand pressing against the glass, as though trying to break through. But the mirror was cold and unyielding. It held her back, trapping her in a world that Mateo could not reach. "Mateo, help me." Her voice, soft and desperate, came from somewhere deep within the mirror. It was as though the words were spoken not aloud, but directly into his mind, a plea that he could feel vibrating through his chest. A wave of panic surged within him. He could see the fear in her eyes now, the terror that gripped her as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the mirror, but she was unable to break free. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself was keeping her imprisoned, and Mateo was powerless to change it. Without thinking, he pressed his hand against the glass, mirroring her gesture. His heart raced, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears. Was this truly Isabel? Was this really her? Or was it just another trick of the forest? Another illusion designed to torment him? The mirror rippled again, and Isabel's face distorted once more, her features stretching and warping into something unrecognizable. The space between them seemed to grow wider, as though the mirror itself were pushing them apart. And then, with one final flicker, the image vanished entirely, leaving only the reflection of Mateo standing alone in the cold light of the chapel. The silence that followed was deafening. Mateo's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands still pressed against the glass. The reality of what had just happened washed over him, and he stumbled back, his knees weak, his mind reeling. What had he just seen? Was it really Isabel, or was it another manifestation? Another twisted trick of the forest that had been playing with his mind all along? His thoughts spiraled, but one thing was certain. The mirror had shown him something he could not ignore. Isabel was still out there, trapped somewhere, and it was up to him to find her. With a final glance at the empty mirror, Mateo turned and walked out of the chapel, his mind racing with the possibilities, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the path ahead was far more treacherous than he had ever imagined. The forest was no longer just a place of darkness and danger. It was a gateway, a link between worlds, and Mateo had just unlocked it. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 14, the final song. The night had fallen heavy and thick over the village, a blanket of oppressive darkness that seemed to settle deep into the earth, as though even the stars were reluctant to shine. Mateo sat by his window, staring out at the distant trees that stretched like silent sentinels toward the horizon. The wind whispered through the village, a soft sigh that sent a chill down his spine. It felt like the forest itself was breathing, waiting, as it always had. In the days since his encounter with the mirror, Mateo had not returned to the chapel. He had not returned to the clearing. Instead, he had locked himself away in his house, as though hoping that by doing so, he could avoid the pull that had grown so relentless. But the truth was undeniable. The forest had him. The mirror had shown him Isabel. He could not escape it. Not now. It was the 15th day since the vision in the chapel, and Mateo could feel it in his bones. This was it. He had waited long enough, tried to run from what was coming, but now the path was clear. He could no longer deny the truth of what the forest wanted, what it had always wanted, and what Isabel had been trying to tell him all along. He had come to understand that the forest was not merely a place of darkness. It was alive, ancient, and powerful, a force that had existed long before the first stone was laid in the village, before the first tree had sprouted from the earth. It was a world unto itself, a mirror of the human soul, a place where the deepest of desires and the darkest of fears took root. Mateo had tried to understand Isabel's absence, the pull of the forest, and the strange happenings that had unfolded over the past days, but the pieces had never quite fit. That is, until now. The forest had been calling to him in ways he had not realized before. He had thought it was Isabel's voice he was hearing, but it wasn't just her. It was the forest itself, speaking through her, through the mirror, through everything that had happened. And now, The forest was ready to reveal its final secret. Mateo stood at the edge of the clearing once more. The air was thick with mist, the kind that clung to his skin and crept into his lungs, cold and damp. It was a haunting stillness that stretched out before him, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the wind. The stone altar stood just as it had before, a silent witness to everything that had happened. The flower, too, was there, still in bloom, its pale petals glowing faintly in the dim light. But this time, there was no fear, only acceptance. As he stepped forward, his mind was quiet for the first time in days. The confusion, the dread, it had all fallen away, leaving only one thing in its place: determination. He had made his choice. The answers lay ahead, in the depths of the forest, and he would follow the path, no matter where it led. The trees around him seemed to stir as if recognizing his resolve. The wind picked up, a soft breath that carried the scent of something ancient, something powerful. The forest was alive, and it was watching. But now, for the first time since he had arrived, Mateo did not feel afraid. He felt at home. He was not simply walking through the forest. He was part of it. It had always been a part of him, just as he was a part of it. The clearing seemed different now. The shadows no longer seemed menacing, but deep, mysterious, like the shadows of a place that had always been there, waiting for him to find it. As Mateo walked deeper into the grove, his eyes fixed on the space before him, the air seemed to shimmer, as though the forest itself were changing, shifting. The ground under his feet became soft, yielding, almost liquid, as if he were walking on the surface of a dream. He continued, not pausing, his steps steady, drawn forward by a force he could not resist. His heart beat in time with the rhythm of the forest, and the sound of his breathing was the only thing that filled the silence. As he reached the center of the clearing, Mateo saw it, the heart of the forest. It was not a place he had ever seen before, not a space he had walked through in his previous journeys. It was a place where time stood still, where the very air pulsed with energy. It was as if the entire forest had converged here, at this one point, this singular place where the past, the present, and the future existed in a delicate balance. At the center of the space stood a large tree, its bark dark and weathered, twisted in strange patterns. Its roots snaked across the ground, disappearing into the earth like fingers reaching down into the depths of the world. And in its branches, there was something that gleamed, something that shimmered like the brightest star in the sky. It was a figure, Isabel. Her form hung suspended in the air, encased in the tree's branches like a cocoon. Her skin was pale, her eyes closed, as though she were sleeping. But there was something hauntingly beautiful about the way she glowed in the dim light, something otherworldly. She was not dead. She was not alive. She was something between. Mateo's breath caught in his throat. His heart twisted painfully, a deep ache settling in his chest. She was here, but she was not fully here. She was a part of the forest now, bound to it, as it had always been with her. The connection between them was undeniable. He stepped forward, reaching out to her, but the moment his fingers brushed the air near the tree, a voice, her voice, whispered through his mind, soft but firm. "Don't," she said, and the single word shook him to his core. "I am where I belong. This is my song, my choice." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a profound sadness. But the sadness was not his own. It was the sadness of the forest, the sadness of the earth itself. Isabel was no longer a person. She was part of the world now, bound to it, just as he was. "Isabel," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling, "I'll find a way. I'll bring you back. I swear it." But Isabel's form shifted then, her glowing figure pulsating with the energy of the forest, and her eyes opened, her gaze locking with his. The sadness in them was overwhelming, but there was something else, too. Peace. She was at peace. "You already have, Mateo," she said, her voice not in words, but in the stillness between them. The words did not come from her mouth, but from the very air, the essence of her being. "You were always meant to be here." This was the final song, Mateo, the song of the forest, the song of our love. And with that, she vanished into the tree, her form dissolving into the bark, becoming one with the very essence of the forest. The trees around Mateo seemed to sigh, their branches swaying in the wind as though mourning her loss, or perhaps celebrating it. Mateo stood there for a long time, his heart heavy but not broken. The forest had claimed her, yes, but it had also given her back to him in a way he had never expected. The love they had shared, the bond that had drawn them together, could not be severed, not even by the darkness of the forest. It had transcended time, transcended life, and become something eternal. The forest had claimed them both, and as Mateo turned to leave, the final song of the forest hummed softly in his ears, a melody of love, loss, and acceptance. A song that would never fade, no matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled. It was the song of their love, and it would echo forever. Chapter 15. The Unraveling Path. The night that followed was colder than any that had come before, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of Mateo's final decision. The wind had ceased, leaving behind an eerie stillness that pressed down on the earth like a secret too heavy to bear. He stood at the edge of the forest, looking back at the dark mass of trees, now no longer a place of mystery, but a place of memory. Memories of Isabel, of the love that had brought him here, and of the truth that had bound them forever. Mateo had walked far from the clearing, far from the altar where he had found Isabel. He had come to the edge of the village, a place where the homes were small, quiet, distant from the heart of the forest, and from where he could still hear the whispers of the night wind that had once spoken through the trees. But now, as he stood in the cold silence, the forest's voice was silent, as though holding its breath. And Mateo, too, held his breath, though he knew deep down that nothing would change. He had walked away, yes. He had stepped back from the threshold that had once felt so inevitable, so pressing. But the forest had already claimed him as it had claimed Isabel, and though he now stood apart from it, he could never be truly free of it. He could feel it in his bones. It was not simply the pull of the forest that haunted him, though. It was the haunting realization of what he had left behind. Isabel's absence, the stillness in the air where her voice had once been. There had been a certain peace in her final words, the knowledge that their love had transcended, that she had returned to the forest in a form more eternal than any human body could hold. Yet still, Mateo felt the ache of her absence like an open wound in his chest. He knew he had to leave, to find something beyond this place, beyond the pull of the forest that had defined his life since his first step into it. The village was quiet now, the homes dark against the starless sky, but the longing in his heart felt like a deep, unfillable well. It was not the kind of ache one could fix with time or distance. It was a grief so deeply rooted in the soul that nothing could erase it, not even the promise of a new life. Days passed, and Mateo did leave. He packed the few belongings he had, knowing well that no matter how far he went, the specter of the forest would be there, following him, not in physical form, but in the memories that would haunt him like shadowy figures in the corners of his mind. He had arrived at a small town far from the village. It was a place filled with people who knew nothing of him, who had no reason to question his presence. There, he found work in the quiet streets, repairing old homes, walking the narrow alleys, and exchanging polite greetings with strangers. It was a life that seemed simple, distant from the haunting beauty of the forest, from the love that had once consumed him. But every night, when he lay in bed, he felt her presence. It had taken him weeks to realize that it wasn't only the absence of Isabel that lingered in his heart. It was the forest itself. The forest which had never let go of him, which had shaped him from the very first moment he entered it. The trees, the wind, the whispers in the dark, they were all still with him, and no matter how far he traveled, he could never escape their grip. He had become a man of two worlds, and no matter how hard he tried to bury the memories, they would surface in his dreams, in the moments of stillness when the weight of the silence would press down on him, reminding him of what he had lost and what had always been part of him. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Mateo found himself standing by the edge of a quiet stream, watching the water move slowly over the rocks. It was the kind of peace he had sought ever since he had left the village. But there was something else there, something that stirred within him. A sense of unease had settled in his chest, as though the world around him was changing, shifting. He couldn't quite place it, but it was a feeling that he could not escape. And then, as if on cue, a figure appeared in the distance. Isabel. Her form shimmered faintly in the fading light, her features just as he remembered, as though she had never truly left. She stood motionless at the edge of the water, her hair drifting in the wind, her gaze distant, as though waiting for something. Her presence, though haunting, was not frightening. No, it was something deeper, something that drew him in, that called to him from a place he could not understand. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice trembling. She did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her form as ethereal as the mist that clung to the earth. "You came back," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He had already known she would return. He had always known. There had never been any real escaping what the forest had claimed. She did not speak, not in words, but in the way she moved toward him, the way her form rippled like water, as though made of something other than flesh and bone. She reached for him, her hand extending in an invitation he could not refuse. And though he had been running from this very moment, though he had tried to carve out a life that was free from the forest's pull, he found himself stepping toward her. His feet moved as though controlled by some unseen force, as though the earth itself had drawn him in. The ache in his chest intensified, his pulse quickened, and before he knew it, he was standing beside her. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but the connection they shared was undeniable. She was not gone. She had never truly left. She was here, in this world and in the next. And in the depths of the forest, they had become one. "Isabel," he whispered again, his voice filled with longing, with regret. "What does this mean? Where do we go now?" Her figure flickered, her eyes finally meeting his. And though no words came, the understanding between them was clear. It was the same understanding they had shared in the forest, at the clearing where their love had first bloomed. She was part of him, just as he was part of her. The love they had shared was not something that could be severed, not something that could be bound by the rules of the living or the dead. It transcended everything. And as the water flowed quietly at their feet, Mateo finally understood. There was no unraveling the path they had walked. There was no returning to a life untouched by the forest. There was no escaping the love that had bound them, the forest that had shaped them. It had always been part of their journey. And now, it was time to move forward. Whatever lay ahead, whatever the forest would ask of him next, he would meet it with Isabel by his side. They had already become something more than they had ever been before. The path, he realized, had never been about escape. It had been about understanding. The forest had not just taken Isabel from him. It had given her back to him, and in doing so, it had given him back to himself. Together, they would walk the path, hand in hand, through every shadow, through every storm, through every quiet moment. The forest would always be with them, and that was enough. Chapter 16. The light beyond the Alhambra. The dawn of the final day was softer than the ones before, as though the world itself had settled into a new rhythm, an unspoken harmony that had been long awaited. The air was still cool, a faint mist clinging to the trees as if the earth itself had awoken from a long slumber. The forest, that ancient, breathing entity, seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though it knew something that no one else did, a secret that lay in the spaces between the shadows and the light. Mateo had stood before the entrance of the forest for what felt like hours, staring into its depths as though waiting for something or someone to call him back. His heart beat in sync with the rustling leaves, the far-off cries of birds and animals that had learned to coexist with the ever-changing cycle of life and death. It was a song of the world he had left behind, a world filled with the weight of sorrow, of love, of memories that would never truly fade. Yet here, standing before the boundary that had once been the threshold between his past and his future, Mateo felt the pull once again. The same pull he had felt the day he first stepped into the forest. It was not the pull of grief, nor of the haunting love that had bound him to Isabel. No, this pull was different. It was the call of something greater, something beyond the realm of the living and the dead. It was the forest itself, inviting him to take the final step in the journey he had only begun to understand. The forest had never been simply a place. It had always been a part of him, as much a part of him as his own heart, his breath, his soul. Isabel had understood that. She had known that their love would never be bound by the confines of mortality, that the forest was a space where the lines between life and death blurred and merged. And now, as he stood at the precipice, he understood too. The trees whispered in the wind, their voices faint but unmistakable. The leaves stirred, as though reaching out to him, inviting him into their embrace. And though he had come so far, had fought so hard to leave behind the weight of the past, the truth was undeniable. There was nowhere else he was meant to be. He had come full circle, back to the place where it all began. Isabel had been waiting for him. Though he had not seen her in many days, he could feel her presence, her love, her essence, hovering just beyond the veil of reality. He had thought, in the moments of despair and doubt, that she was lost to him, that her memory would be the only connection they would ever have. But love, true love, does not die. It transcends. It endures. And Isabel's love was still with him, still waiting for him to come home. He had left the village, left behind the life he had tried to build in a world that had never truly felt like his own. There, he had tried to outrun the memories of the forest, the pull of the trees, the weight of the love he had shared with Isabel. But in his heart, he knew there was no running away, no escaping the truth that had always been clear to him. The forest was where he belonged. The sun had risen fully now, casting a soft, golden light across the landscape. It illuminated the edges of the forest in a warm, inviting glow, and as Mateo took his first steps back into the familiar terrain, he felt a peace wash over him. The forest had been his beginning, and now it would be his end. But it was not an end in the way he had once imagined it. There was no finality here. There was only the endless cycle of love, of connection, of return. As he walked deeper into the trees, the air around him seemed to thicken, growing warmer with each step. The path that had once seemed so dark, so filled with mystery, now seemed bathed in light, the branches overhead parting like the opening of a long-forgotten door. The leaves shimmered in the light, reflecting colors that Mateo had never seen before. Colors that were not of the earth, but of something beyond, something otherworldly. He had not come here to die. He had come here to live, to embrace the love that had been waiting for him, to reunite with the soul that had always been a part of his own. The forest, with its ancient wisdom, had never intended to separate them. It had always been a bridge, a doorway to something greater. And as he moved through the forest, his heart began to beat in time with the pulse of the earth. Each step he took was not a step toward an end, but a step toward a new beginning. Finally, he reached the clearing, the one where it had all started, the place where Isabel had first appeared to him, where they had exchanged their first words, their first touches, their first kiss. The memories flooded back, washing over him like a tide, each one more vivid than the last. Isabel's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the way her eyes had shone when they looked into his. All of it, still so real, still so alive in his heart. And there, standing at the center of the clearing, was Isabel. She was no longer the ghostly figure that had haunted his dreams, no longer the memory that had danced at the edge of his consciousness. She was whole again, her form as solid and as alive as the forest itself. Her hair flowed around her like the wind, and her eyes, filled with the same love that had drawn him to her all those years ago, looked at him as if she had never left. "Mateo," she said, her voice the softest whisper, yet it filled the clearing like a song, like a prayer. "You've come home." His heart swelled, and for the first time since he had left the village, since he had stepped away from the love he thought he had lost, he felt complete. The ache in his chest, the longing that had plagued him for so long, was gone. It had been replaced by something more powerful, more enduring: love. In the silence that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. The forest, the trees, the very earth beneath their feet, all of it seemed to recognize what had just happened. The union of two souls that had been separated, not by distance, but by time, by the boundaries of the living and the dead. And now, those boundaries no longer mattered. Isabel reached out to him, her hand warm and steady. As he took it, he felt the final piece of himself fall into place. There was no more running, no more questioning. The forest had not taken Isabel from him. It had only given her back to him, in a form that was beyond death, beyond time, beyond the world they had known. And as they stood together in the clearing, the first rays of the sun catching the edges of Isabel's form, Mateo realized that they had not been apart at all. They had simply been waiting for this moment, for this return, for the final embrace. The forest, the love that had brought them together, would always remain with them, forever entwined, forever connected, forever part of each other. In the end, love had not been lost. It had only been waiting for the right moment to bloom again. And in that moment, everything was perfect.